Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Centre for Policy Studies event on rewiring the state, data, connectivity and government in the digital age. Thank you very much for bearing with us due to the unavoidable circumstances in which we had to cancel the first attempt at this panel. But this is both an incredibly good panel and an incredibly relevant topic. As we attempt to build back better from the pandemic, the attention is turning very much to the effectiveness of government as opposed to just to how much money we spend on it. With these sort of frightening backlogs in the NHS, justice, all sorts of other areas in the UK, the provision of digital services is becoming a real area of focus. And I'm delighted that we have with us the minister from the country which actually genuinely is sort of in the way that the UK was for a while, and in the 2010s, and then Estonia took up the torch. Greece is now where all of the cool kids go to find out about how to do digital government properly. So I'm really delighted to have the minister with us and to have a really good panel of other experts to talk about these issues. Matt Warman, who obviously was the former minister on exactly these issues in the UK, as well as Priya, Lakhani and Cameron Brooks, who have an enormous range of expertise as well. So I'll basically shut up now and let the experts talk. Minister, why don't you kick us off with, we'll have some opening remarks from everyone and then get to the discussion and debate. Please feed in your questions via the Q&A box, or if you're watching on YouTube or Twitter, just reply there and message, and we will be picked up by our team. So with that, Minister Pierrakakis.
Thank you so much. It's a great joy to be with you, and I think it's a great opportunity that we can talk on a series of issues that touch upon, first of all, my portfolio, but overall, I would say issues that deeply interest the Greek government, the Prime Minister himself, how we can change the relationship between the state and its citizens, how to change overall the way the state works. And needless to say, back in 2019, when this new ministry was created, the fact that this was possible in the Greek case was not a given. It was something which we wanted to change for decades. We have been considered to have perennial levels of bureaucracy in Greece on a series of life events that citizens face when they interact with the state. And if you view those life events from the birth of a child to the passing of a loved one, within that time frame, you can condense a series of events, from renewing driver's licenses or enrolling in the university. So the idea here was that we need to connect digital with service design, with a series of key performance indicators on state performance. And we started back in 2019 from low levels of digitization in Greece. We can actually have a sense of how many digital transactions we had between the citizens and the state back in 2018. Back then we had 8.8 million such transactions. Those are, let's say, visits not physically made. We moved to 34 million transactions in 2019, to 94 million in 2020, and just in the first semester of 2021, we have 150 million digital transactions in a semester. So this is a classical exponential curve, and this is, I would say, an exponential change taking place in the way the Greek state works. Obviously, we were very much inspired by the UK. Robert mentioned the UK government. I would say that our key inspiration here was the creation of the government digital service, if I'm not mistaken, in 2011. The key project there was Gov.uk. We felt, because reforms are a little bit like transplants, you need to have a donor-receiver compatibility. You can be inspired, but you cannot copy-paste away all the changes that you want to make. You need to develop your own solutions in your own domestic policy context. But Gov.uk was the key inspiration for what we wanted to do. So it's quite interesting that we started Gov.gr, which is not, it's similar, but it has differences from Gov.uk. I would say that it's more service-driven. So we started by aggregating in March 2020, the pre-existing digital services of the Greek state, the ones that worked well. And we found out that we had 501 such services back then. And we started building this new edifice, service by service, originally week by week, I would say now day by day. So now we have a bit less than 1,300 services around 20 months later. Again, This gov.gr portal, which we have developed, is the new way, the unique point of contact that we want citizens to have with the Greek state. And we add services, new services, which are quite frequent and in terms of how frequently they're being used, and quite popular in terms of their digital solution that we advanced, that it's a policy area quite endorsed by Greek citizens. And this is why we believe this is a true policy game changer vis-a-vis the way we have designed state services. Thank you.
That's really helpful. And I think one thing we may get to later is the question of whether coming to something later enabled you to leap further in a sort of rather than having to wrestle with the consequences of decisions made in previous generations. Priya, would you like to respond to that and offer your own take on where we are?
Well, obviously, thank you very much for having me, firstly. So I'm Priya Lakhani. I'm the Chief Executive of Century Tech. I'm also at NED for the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. What Greece has been doing is incredibly inspiring. And I think I'm going to state the obvious here, Robert, and I'm going to say that, look, we all understand that we can catalyse innovation with the use of data. We've seen that very much so in the private sector. We can think about, and we should absolutely talk about things like infrastructure, interoperability, and how to do that with data. We can make, more faster, more effective, more accurate decisions using data. Innovators can create products and services to better society, and society can become fairer as a result of it. And that's with some provisos in terms of taking into account privacy and security. I was very pleased to see the National Data Strategy from the United Kingdom, and we've really changed the emphasis of data from being seen primarily as something to be protected from in terms of harm to being understood as an asset that ought to be exploited in the right way. And although I was happy to see that, there are actions in there that we need to see certainly developed upon. For example, we talked about data maturity models for government departments. We need to talk about the legal regimes for data. There's been some tremendous work done, I think, by the civil service in the UK on data adequacy, and I know that they've worked really hard on that. There needs to be that political ownership to drive forward. And I know that I'm probably not the right person in the panel to be speaking about this, and we have Matt soon speak about this, but there needs to be that ownership politically to drive forward the data agenda. And we need to, and the reason really where I come from this is the perspective of public and private partnerships. So how can we work across the public and private sector to realise that value from data? There's lots of conversations as well in the UK about open data. We've got the treasure trove of the NHS as well. So how can we, work with a public-private sector sort of balance to realise the value of that? Recently, just to raise something that was really interesting in the UK, the charity sector, charity leaders, just to give everyone a slightly different example, called for a cross-sector strategy to plug what they're calling a data chasm, and that's leaving some of the sector operating in the dark. So if we had that political drive, if we could look across all sectors, particularly sectors for good, and how we could create some sort of innovation. We've got these challenges, obviously, in various strategies that are being developed by government to try and to essentially help to innovate in these areas, to provide grant funding in these areas. And I think there's something really interesting that can be done in the United Kingdom. We've got a long way to go. There's an enormous amount that the private sector can show in terms of innovation as to where this could be. But I think one of the outcomes that we've also got to look at is within government. So when we're making decisions within government, what's really interesting is that in the private sector, you'll have a large organisation responsible for, many stakeholders. We're talking hundreds of thousands to millions of stakeholders. They can make accurate decisions in real time based on data, based on the blend of from a data strategy, then developing an AI strategy, and on top of that, then looking at big data analysis. When we look at government and within government, how can we, while ensuring that we have security, we've not just got one big database holding everything, but how can we ensure that government ministers and policymakers in government can make fast decisions based on real-time data? A quick example to end this, I'll give you, in education, for example, at Century, we could have, for example, today we can segment the country into regions, into the counties, and we can see in literacy and numeracy today how students are performing and where the gaps in knowledge and skills are. And that sort of information allows one to then potentially make policy decisions to try and plug those gaps. Government, when does government receive this data, and when can they then analyse that data? Usually it's the end of the year, an academic year, when they get exam results. So there's plenty of examples within government as well in terms of policy making where we can make so much more use of data. So I'm really interested into the panel discussion as to how we might be able to further that, and certainly learning a lot more from Greece into how they've actually done that. And I suppose the big question for me is upskilling within government to Greece. How did you manage that, and how did you essentially overcome the change management, the sort of the skeptics in government, to ensure that all stakeholders are on board with this national data strategy that you've created? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we'll go to Matt Warman, former Minister of Digital Infrastructure, and then finally Dr. Cameron Brooks, General Manager of Europe at Amazon Web Services. Sorry, I should have given everyone's job titles before, but I always want to just get into the meat of it quickly. And Matt, I'd be interested particularly in whether you feel that Greece has indeed stolen a march on us, or whether you want to defend the honour of the UK system, or whether you think there are other countries we can and should be looking at as well.
Well, thank you, Rob. I think the league table that we got into, which, as you referred to, sort of everyone used to look to Estonia. Now you're absolutely right that people do look to Greece. But actually, the thing that strikes me is that everyone has got that goal that is twofold. And one is the straightforward digitization of public services, which is, although I say straightforward, is immensely challenging in itself. But everyone knows what that is, if that makes sense. It is, as the Minister described at the beginning of this conversation, it is about making those existing transactions easier and simpler. And then there is a second goal, which is using data to enhance policymaking, to enhance public services, and also to sort of do things we don't yet know we could do. And I think those two things sometimes get conflated. It is definitely true that Greece is doing great things, but when we were looking at what digital identity in the UK's future might look like, then we looked to the Nordics, we looked to Australia, we looked to a whole host of places. And the reason I mention that is because your question, Robert, at the beginning of if you come slightly later to these respective parties, can you leap ahead in the same way that on infrastructure, huge swathes of Africa will not end up with fibre broadband, they'll end up with 5G and beyond. Can we drag and drop some existing, for instance, digital identity providers into the UK system? Well, I think the answer is definitely yes, but there are two things that struck me about holding us back on the digitization aspect of this. And the first was the fragmentation of UK government, in the sense that we have different departments, but we also have huge amounts of data that is held by local government, and huge numbers of public services that are held by what the public might think of as government. But when it comes to making an appointment at your GP, clearly a public service, but clearly not something where the UK government has a huge amount of sway over the individual system that the individual private business that is a GP practice might be able to provide to their patients. So there is a huge amount of standardization that I think needs to happen. And what I think is driving some of that forward is obviously the pandemic. People are a lot more amenable to doing a lot more online. A meeting like this, for instance, with an international attendance, I'm not necessarily sure that I would be thinking that doing this in person will be the way that the CPS would want to default every time. So our attitudes have fundamentally shifted, and that's a really positive thing in lots of ways, positive for the planet as well. But that enthusiasm from the public then butts up against the back end of a lot of what these systems and the bureaucracy around it actually is built on. So we don't just need to put a nicer front end on public services. It's not as though the government is not using a sort of gov.uk model much more widely across the state and across the public sector through choice. It's very often because the systems behind it need fundamental, really expensive modernisation, and a lot of that is based on the imperfect ability to verify the identity of an individual citizen to a sufficient level. And that digital identity piece, to me, seems to be absolutely key to the effective digitization of public services. Now, that said, the other thing that is a real problem is I think we've tended to be quite hesitant, where a Google or a Facebook will build a service and maybe not quite ask for forgiveness rather than permission, but they will certainly build a compelling product and say, let's just get on with it. People will like it. People will give up a certain degree of control over their data if they see the value in it. The state obviously has a different relationship, but I do think what we could do with is to be slightly more forward-leaning, both in terms of, I wouldn't necessarily say cracking some heads together across government, but bringing people together into one room and saying, right, we all agree that this is the right thing to do. Can we actually get on with doing it? And also making it clear to the public that the government looks at the private sector models of interaction with customers and thinks that we should be doing just as well too. So if you look at, for instance, when the Chancellor was doing the various bits of the COVID support, he was personally involved not just in the design of the scheme, but also in the design of the website that customers use to access the scheme. So I think there is an understanding right at the top of government that we need to build compelling products and we need them to look just as good as the services that they are up against in the minds of the consumer. And that might sound very superficial, but it has to be built on some pretty fundamental reforms at the back end, and it has to be built on an understanding that the public doesn't necessarily differentiate between, is this GP surgery a private business that's working for the NHS, or is it the broader British state? And the fact that we've done so well in gov.uk in some places, I think is an immensely positive sign of what Britain is capable of. I don't think we should necessarily worry too much, as I said at the beginning, about who is at the very top of that league table, because one of my bugbears was that comparing the UK state to the Estonian state is obviously an ambitious thing to do, but they are very different places with very different histories, with very different sizes of population and all of that. The second thing that I'll just come on to briefly is that much greater potential to streamline UK public services if we unlock some of the barriers to data protection. And that's not to say that we should compromise security or privacy in any sense, but it is to say, for instance, that certainly around health data, the public thinks that it's absolutely mad that a hospital can't see the data that is locked away in your GP surgery, and it is dangerous as well. So I think we need to be much braver about trying to have those arguments about unlocking the power of data sharing, both across the public sector and where the public sector meets the private sector. And I think anyone who understands this knows that there are ways of doing it that don't necessarily compromise privacy, don't mean selling your data to some faceless private corporation, whoever people might be scared of that particular week. But we do need to make sure that privacy is protected, but also people understand the real power of interconnecting those different data sets so that people can have a much more productive relationship with the state. And I think that's what we're probably all aiming for. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. And speaking of giant faceless corporations that people are occasionally uncomplimentary about, but in fact do an enormous amount for all of us, Dr. Brooks, would you like to pick up the baton?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Robert, and thanks for having me on this panel. A really important topic, data connectivity and government. So let me just first introduce AWS, Amazon Web Services. Some of you probably know is the cloud computing business of Amazon. And through our global infrastructure, we have over 175 fully featured cloud services that help customers transform running their operations, lowering costs, becoming more agile, innovating faster. We have 100,000 customers in the UK, including organizations such as AstraZeneca, Barclays, the BBC, EDF Energy, and public sector organizations, Department of Work and Pensions, HMRC, Home Office, Ministry of Justice, and the NHS are just some examples. So we are in this game. We are in the middle of helping governments digitally transform, and so we welcome this ambition set up by the UK government on the national data strategy, because it recognizes the crucial role that a data regime will play in supporting innovation and future growth. This open, trusted dialogue with industry around how to harness data and accelerate digital transformation is critically important. We're happy to participate in these efforts and happy to be, on discussions and panels such as this. We believe the focus being placed on security and resilience is correct. We share the objective that the services we all rely upon on a daily basis need to be safe. They need to be secure. However, we also want to make sure that a framework is considered, a framework that encourages innovation at the same time as ensuring the security and resilience, a secure and resilient data ecosystem. So in a proportionate manner, we don't want to sacrifice the innovation. That's the main thing. So just, to get real specific, digital services and the use of data have been integral to the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Adaptations have allowed the economy to continue to function. And this is actually where I'd like to compliment my fellow panelist, Minister Pierrakakis, on the work being done in Greece. In early 2020, last year, AWS signed an MOU with his ministry, with the Ministry of Digital Governance in Greece. And this is how we were able to see firsthand their focus on providing better, more modern government services to citizens through the digital transformation of the state. And just some really specific examples. Services such as the passenger locator form were built on AWS in just 6 days, followed our well-architected framework using all the relevant security and data privacy services. And it's shielded from malicious attacks, operating smoothly for over a year. Another example, the Greece vaccination rollout platform runs entirely on AWS cloud and has experienced zero downtime. So examples such as this show that, what we think is a close public-private cooperation is a key ingredient to deliver the best technology for digital transformation of the rewired state. This in combination with a focus on building the right skills, as was mentioned before, enabling the UK to execute on its vision of becoming a global leader in science and technology. So those are just some kind of introductory comments from me. Looking forward to the discussion.
That's great. Thank you very much. I suppose if we go back to to Minister Pierrakakis first, what from what's just been said sort of strikes a chord with you about Greece's experience? There's various challenges that have been laid out. Obviously, the digitalization of customer interactions, another example you could have given is the furlough scheme and the dramatic expansion of that here in the UK. There's the data piece, and then there's a trust piece. There's about what people's reaction to people's willingness to have their data shared. Are those issues you've come across, and how did you resolve them?
First of all, let me begin by addressing a previous question which you said, which was, vis-a-vis digitization itself, and whether someone who is not a front runner has more to benefit in the process. And I think there is no rule of thumb here, but I think that's the only productive way to see it. Meaning that if you're a laggard, if you're not a front runner, then the only mentality which you should have is trying to use this as an advantage and leapfrog from the experience of others. So it's not obvious that this is possible. On some things, it's not. So, for instance, you mentioned somebody mentioned Africa before as an example. One of the speakers, and vis-a-vis fixed broadband. And indeed, in the Greek case, for instance, in fixed telephony, in fiber to the home, our performance is not as good as our performance in mobile and transitioning to 5G. The geography of the country played a role, but we felt that 5G enabled us to leapfrog, let's say, and this is why we're 25th in mobile, but 100th in fixed telephony in Greece. So it's one of the areas where we cannot move as fast. We cannot become a front runner, fixed telephony. But if we view telecom as a holistic, let's say, policy area, then there are elements of telecom where leapfrogging is possible. So the key challenge, addressing the last question that you said, Robert, that we tried to solve using digital was actually, we studied the UK, we studied Estonia. Estonia, you cannot reverse engineer. Estonia has its own institutional path. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Estonia is a campus, it's not a map. But we felt that Estonia is interesting for inspiration. And this is why we decided to use Estonia as a paradigm, but not as a roadmap. The UK for us was a more interesting roadmap on certain things like gov.uk. But on others, for instance, we understood that digitization needs to go hand in hand with simplification. And we placed our focus starting, let's say, around a year before the last election. So we had our national election mid-2019. So we started this process under the supervision of the Prime Minister, then leader of the opposition, who actually had this portfolio when he was minister, focusing on the creation of a new organization, the Ministry of Digital Governance. So we decided that this new ministry should have, apart from data, let's say, strategy, apart from digital strategy, apart from telecom, it should also have the responsibility of business process reengineering, as we say in the private sector, of government process reengineering, as we would say in the case of government. So the core capacity for simplifications, the core responsibility for simplifications, together with digitization, is in this ministry. And we felt that this is quite important and quite significant when we're trying to simplify and digitize digital interactions. The key lesson that I had, and that my team had, was that it was very significant to do this on day zero, not even on day one. So we passed let's say, all relevant legislation and all relevant regulatory changes the next day after the government was formed. And we needed to do this in order to have everything in place together with the strategy to be able to accelerate this policy.
Yes, and I think that's a theme of UK history, that sort of focus and attention from the centre is often a very sort of powerful determinant of what happens. But to pick up a question which has come from a couple of our come up in the Q&A as well, and actually echoes Dr. Brooks's remarks. First to you, but then more widely for the panelists. What's the balance of public and private here? So obviously, I mean, one of the lessons that the UK found in its journey on this path was that it started off was that it needed to build more of its own capacity internally, and had let too much go to sort of very large sort of multinational contracting firms, which it was locked into contracts with. But then equally, as time has gone by since the 2010s, we've had the rise of firms like AWS, we've had cloud, we've had the ability do lots and lots of private providers springing up who can be more agile. Is there an ideal balance between doing things out in-house, contracting them out, building state capacity, or creating an open market? What's your sort of take on that?
I'm smiling because this was the key dilemma that we had. The key question that we were trying to solve back in the day was exactly this, and we decided that the right answer here for us was whatever works best, depending on the question. So we knew that we needed to do some significant capacity building, and we did. We have, let's say, our own lab, which is called EDITE, GRNet in English, which develops some of our solutions, but it does develop those solutions hand in hand with the private sector, with smaller or bigger contractors, depending on the system. In reality, here, the key lesson for us was that we needed to build interdisciplinary teams. So there was one question prior to this question: who are the right people to sit on the table when you're trying to solve a puzzle? Let's say when you're trying to simplify the interaction between state services for a specific question, like digitization of pensions, for instance. And we felt that we needed IT experts, but we didn't only need IT experts. We needed lawyers. We needed people who have deep knowledge of how, let's say, the structure of the pension system interacts with all the other structures of the state. So A, we created those interdisciplinary teams. B, we tried to then answer this question on the basis of capacity, the availability of who can help us or not. And being agnostic vis-a-vis the question that you raised, I think is the best way to go. Follow up with regards to whatever works best for you. Don't have a specific mindset on this question, I think is the answer.
I think that's absolutely right, isn't it? That as countries, we can often compare ourselves to other countries and their journey, but you've got to look at yourselves, and it's very simple. You look at the goals that you want to achieve. Is it, for example, in healthcare? Is it capacity? Is it speed? Of seeing people. What is it that you actually want to achieve, and what's the problem that you're trying to address? And private may well be the answer there. And then it coming to sort of Matt's point, you then, as well as the goals, you've got to look at the problems. Well, what may occur, and it's about those frameworks that he talked about as well. It's about having those infrastructure in place. So, for example, and there's a lot of work in the UK being done here. At the moment we're talking about, obviously, online safety will be debated in Parliament I think after Christmas, we've got the innovation strategy created by Bayes. We have the data strategy I mentioned earlier. We have a digital strategy. It's all about these roadmaps and strategies. But, you know, these all then come together to develop those frameworks. And some of that will obviously involve regulation, because that's where potentially we're trying to protect us from harms and protect citizens from harms. And it's about putting all of that together. And so the answer is quite right, you know, in terms of Greece's point of view, is what's best for the UK? What do we actually want to achieve here? And there shouldn't be some sort of ideological, well, it's got to be the state, or no, it should be private. It should be, what's the best way to achieve those goals? And then let's ensure that we protect our citizens from any potential harms that we right now, you know, we know may occur. And then we obviously don't know what we don't know, which is why regulation often chases innovation's tail, if you like.
Would anyone else like to come in on that? So,
yeah. So I mean, I'd agree with what both the speakers have said so far. I mean, the trouble is the most ideological people are always the people who say, well, we just do what works, and that's why we've confirmed our bias that what works is getting the state to do it, or vice versa. What I found hardest in some ways about some of this was very often the sort of old cliche of no one ever got fired for hiring IBM kind of thing. It is something that is quite hard to push against, especially when you're doing something that is genuinely novel. And all of this digitization of public services is pushing boundaries on what's the right balance between privacy and the state, or an agency of the state holding data about people in a way that does raise concerns. People are instinctively more worried about a big database centrally held than they are about their paper medical records held at their local GP surgery. But so I think what is challenging about this stuff is to realize that what is sometimes to recognize that we all have our own ideological preferences, and sometimes those are much more persistent than we might think. And that's partly why some of it comes back to this sense that it is from the centre that really drives this sort of stuff, to force those decisions to get to a point where you really start building things. I do think it's interesting that there is increasingly a divergence around the world between countries that have created a digital department, a digital chunk of government that is there to cut across some of these boundaries, versus those that, as the UK government tends to say, we want digital to be embedded into every single department, so that every single department does as much as it can in this agenda. I think there's lots of those competing tensions. All of them get in the way of building compelling products, which is what the focus really should be.
Robert and team, what I would add here is from a company perspective, right, the private sector here, I'll just say that we're available. We are ready to make our expertise available to governments who want to digitally transform, and we've been doing that across Europe and across the world. There is a new normal in moving to solutions such as cloud computing. It's becoming the business enabler for customers in almost every segment, and so why should public service be any different? Why should governments not take advantage of those services, because customers and citizens are using them in almost every other industry? Cost may be the starter for that shift to cloud, but very often it's the agility. It's the ability to quickly innovate, to try things, to spin up servers and IT very quickly, and do that in a secure way, where you have the best data protection available, to do it in a resilient way where your services are available. And so that's, we'll continue to make that available, because we don't want governments to be held back, to be, sacrificing their ability to compete. Because if you're not, getting into a digital transformation mindset, you're going to move slower as a country. You're going to probably increase costs, and you're going to have a limited capacity to offer innovative services to your citizens. And so I think that's where we're going to be available to support governments in their pace to digitally transform.
Thank you. So there's, I mean, there's all sorts of directions we can go in this, and all sorts of stuff, things coming in the Q&A. But one question which might help us pin things down is from Carl Williams, asked about healthcare in particular, what the potential is, and the NHS backlog. I mean, Matt, you already mentioned the idea of being able to more easily share data between between primary care and hospital care. I mean, what did the panel on this specific, and obviously, sorry, I'm just babbling slightly, but this is obviously extremely germane because of the pandemic and the experience of test and trace here, but also the vaccine program and the different ways that data was used or not used well. I'd be fascinated, again with the comparison with Greece, and just if we look at this area in particular, where people think the real opportunities and challenges are.
I suppose just briefly from me, I'd say there are again two things. There's one, the more we are able to look at the data that is held currently, the better we should be able to triage patients much more effectively than we have previously. So the idea that you have got fundamentally a challenge with the number of nurses and doctors currently available in the system, and you stretch it through the use of locums and paying people overtime and all that, but fundamentally we are short of people to do those jobs, and that's why the government had that as a manifesto commitment pre-pandemic. It's now even more pressing. So using the data that we've got to make sure that we are applying what the resources we have to those who need it most is obviously priority number one, and that's part of why there's a big digital transformation element in Sajid Javid's plans. But the much greater prize for the NHS is that uniquely within the whole world set of different competing healthcare systems, it should have that enormous treasure trove of data that allows you to do interesting things with clinical data and clinical trials. It should have that ability to use AI because of the scale in a way that's much more effective. And ultimately, we should be able to supercharge the genomic sequencing trials that we're starting to do, thanks to the most recent budget, so that you really do get the economies of scale that we'd all imagine the health service provides, and in fact, historically hasn't really delivered on. So I feel like there is huge potential to do what we do currently better, but the real prize is actually in a longer term view.
Yes, and I'll just nip in here before.
Sorry, do you mind if I add to that point of Matt's, because I think it's really important, because this is something that I'm incredibly passionate about. But we do have a really amazing precedent in healthcare. We've got NHS X, and so when we're talking about data and we're talking about how we can innovate in that particular area, we're talking about working with various trusts who can speed up procurement. We're talking about funds of money from government that could be allocated to local projects, where we saw, I think, 35 local projects receive an allocation of funding in terms of helping them with innovation and then allowing us to then prove those innovations. That sort of typical lean, agile, startup, very entrepreneurial way of doing things in the private sector, where the government is supporting it. We do have an incredible precedent in NHSX. So maybe if that model works for us, is there an education X? Is there a work and pensions X? Is there a security X? Is there, and I just think, sorry, just to add to that, because that is something that the UK has done that is actually really extraordinary. And I thought it was well worth a mention as a fantastic precedent that potentially we can build on.
No, thank you. And actually, I mean, health actually sort of allows us partly to answer one of the other questions someone asked about the potential for AI, and I suppose my quick observation on that would be that there's quite a lot of potential for AI to do extraordinary things, as DeepMind will tell you. But I was talking to some doctors who, in a major acute hospital in London, where just by basically having patients' data, like their kind of heart rates and stuff, reported back to a central thing, and running that against a very, very simple set of algorithms about what's likely to get patients to get worse, they were able to deploy nurses to those patients, several hours before their condition would have worsened. So there were just enormous opportunities here. Anyway, sorry, probably start with, I shouldn't talk about it. It's just an area I'm passionate about. But Minister, on health in particular, and what's your experience?
Let me start by saying that there was a very interesting essay written by Yuval Harari in March 2020 in the Financial Times at the beginning of the pandemic. This essay basically said, it was called After the Pandemic. And which was quite interesting because the pandemic was just beginning. And there, what Yuval Harari basically said was that, governments are going to have a dilemma in digital policy between empowerment and surveillance. And I guess that the reason why our policy has been considered to be quite popular in Greece is because we picked empowerment in terms of the services. And I think that our strategy on digital health was the key element of this empowerment. And let me give you one concrete example. We had, since I think 2013, we have had an e-prescription system, but which was only accessible to doctors, not to patients. So one of the first things that we did was that we made prescriptions, digital prescriptions available to patients. This was extremely useful during lockdown because doctors could prescribe medication and you could receive your prescription on your mobile phone. And then we said that we're going to be building our digital patient records on top of the system, adding layers of data, interoperability of data between the hospitals, primary care, diagnostic centers, and of course, this national prescription system. I guess because you also raised something which in my view is extremely significant before, how can you handle concerns about privacy? Because at the end of the day, trust is like this game that we used to play, the Jenga game. I don't know if you remember it, where it's quite difficult to construct the building, but if you remove the wrong brick, it collapses automatically. So it's difficult to gain trust. It's easy to lose trust. As long as every service that you provide fulfills, the positive aspects of this equation, it solves a problem that citizens have. Then, in a sense, you can justify any new digital policy that you are advancing. So I think that this is going to be the challenge moving forward vis-a-vis AI. Troves of data that we have in health can be extremely significant, extremely with regards to predictive medicine and targeted examinations, which we can propose to citizens on the basis of the data that we have. This is something that Greece is going to start doing by the beginning of 2022. We will start sending free examinations on the basis of the data that we have in our e-prescription system. And let me just add that this system proved to be quite instrumental in national vaccination, exactly because we could prioritize citizens who had specific conditions because of the fact that what prescriptions they had were associated with specific ICD-10s, i.e. with specific conditions. And we told citizens that if you have this condition, you can have your vaccine quicker. So there is a narrative issue here always, placing citizens at the core of the proposition. So apart from, putting our values in our national and in our political debates, our values are also reflected in the screens of code, not only in the books of law. And we need to be very clear about how we project those values and those ideas and those policies in any type of debate that we have with citizens, especially with those who are not digitally skilled.
Yes. Would anyone else like to come in this, or will I? Okay. Well, so next question, and apologies to those asking questions. I'm trying to combine sort of themes from them so that we can get through quite a few. But two questions on the specifics. What role do you envisage for open source and open standards, opening up the collaboration between public sector and private companies? And it wouldn't be a tech panel without the question: what role do you see for blockchain in all of this, in particular in addressing privacy concerns?
Shall I start? So I guess the same philosophy applies here as well. You reverse engineer the problem. You do not start from the solution. You start from the problem which you're trying to solve. I think that this was the epicenter of our proposition here in Greece. So the types of problems that we're trying to solve obviously can fit with those types of solutions. Open standards, I think, can be quite significant vis-a-vis catalyzing both investment, transparency, etc., in a full spectrum of choices that we have in the digital sphere. Blockchain in particular, I think is quite important for security considerations. And in order to do this, of course, you first need to regulate it. You first need to have a very clear sense of how you're going to approach this legally, and not only technologically. Greece is a member of the European Union. Vis-a-vis privacy, we follow the General Data Protection Regulation. Vis-a-vis blockchain, obviously the European Union is advancing its own choices, but there on a full spectrum of technological solutions, we plan to try to be first movers. So especially on blockchain, it's one of the areas where we're going to try to regulate and pass specific pieces of legislation vis-a-vis the applicability of blockchain and specific technological solutions, which we're going to try to advance on a series of questions like in shipping or in other areas where we feel that this extra layer of security commensurate with blockchain is significant and can offer a significant added value.
Anyone else like to?
Yeah, no, so I mean, just on blockchain, I'm delighted that we've moved on from the phase of everyone saying blockchain is the solution to everything within a certain kind of conference circuit to actually looking at what is a practical application and where does it really add something. And I think it's becoming clear that there are some genuine use cases, and there are some things where actually government should be focusing on the basics, for want of a better phrase. I also think that sense of whether the UK approach, where we are sort of obviously not constrained by the strictures of the EU, but still very, very much needing to make sure that we are aligned in a way that works for UK business and for EU business. I think potentially that kind of creative tension produces some genuinely innovative policy making. I think the data strategy is an interesting example of where we might be able to go next, for instance. And it is to some extent a test case for Brexit, because if you can have that best of both worlds, then it really does deliver on some of those ambitions that the Prime Minister and others have set out. So I think there's lots of reasons to be excited about the future of privacy and the future of what comes after GDPR, both for the EU and for the UK, possibly more so than blockchain, but I don't want to sound too skeptical.
I think it's all of these technologies. I mean, we talked about AI and now blockchain. It's very much the case of, we all know first we need a proper data strategy within all those departments. It's very fragmented, as we've mentioned before. And then, we could look at, okay, well, what might that infrastructure look like, interoperability. And then blockchain, I mean, it's really exciting. I think that those departments that are a little bit further ahead than others, a government pilot project would be the right way forward, creating a secure infrastructure, and allowing essentially that particular department to be able to develop upon that. Obviously, what comes with that is, with these technologies, certain algorithms are then created so that should certain conditions be met, then that can be shared with a third party. And so this whole conversation now that we're having about public and private as well sort of falls into that. So how could that infrastructure actually be set so that we could see the benefits of all of these sorts of issues that we've discussed in the panels today? But in the UK, I love having these conversations. I'm an entrepreneur. It's really exciting. And I'm really passionate about, Robert, the example you gave about some actually quite simple uses. It's not rocket science to think about how you could use health data to start, preventative care, and that was really exciting. But sometimes when we're talking about obviously government and government infrastructure, we need to also, rather than sort of, we need to, walk before we're trying to run. And so the idea is have the conversation and be open to those pilot projects. So I must say that, what I've seen certainly at DCMS is a real appetite to be able to explore, what is possible. And you've certainly got a civil service. I noticed in one of the questions, it was about upskilling ministers, policymakers. I always think there are three types of people in any organisation. There are ones that when you give them an idea that's about innovation, they'll say it's the wrong way. There are ones that say this is the right way. And then there are those that say there's always a better way. And what I do have to say is that there are certainly a lot of civil servants at DCMS right at the top and filtering through, from below the director level, that certainly think there's always a better way when it comes to data. So I'm as excited and ambitious as you are, but also just being realistic about, the data strategy first, and then upon that, an AI strategy. In terms of infrastructure, we should certainly be looking at blockchain and the benefits that it brings, but just trying to ensure that it's an organised approach within UK government, because otherwise a disorganised approach UK government ends up looking quite chaotic, simply because it is actually quite fragmented in the way in which, we're not Estonia. And I think we just certainly need to recognise that.
I would just add a little bit here, Robert. Definitely agree with the approach to a data strategy. There's a lot that can be gained from using open standards, open data, and bringing that together on a platform. So, for example, we have supported a number of initiatives around open data in areas such as weather, sustainability, space, and health as well. And actually, what the World Health Organization put together from the last couple of years was built on a platform that enabled a lot of that data to be shared from around the world. And so that only would have happened if there was the ability to support open data and bring it into a platform that could be analyzed and the decisions to be made. So that's going to be critically important, but also recognize that there is data that governments, do want to keep close to their vests and keep protected in a secure manner. And so what I'll just say with regards to that and blockchain is we're constantly going to be innovating on behalf of our customers to make sure that they have the latest they need to use blockchain to secure some of these services, or to secure data in an open, transparent manner, so that the standards are clear. The data can be transferred; it's not locked in, and so that's critical in any of these discussions. And yeah, we're happy to make sure that's available.
Thank you. So for what's probably our final round of questioning, or almost the last one, I was going to ask about the impact of Brexit, but Matt dealt quite nicely with that. Though if anyone else wants to feed in on the good or bad of that, please do. But I think there's a sort of overarching question here, which comes from, I mean, there's if you can see in the chat from Anna Powell-Smith, there's a nice question about how you actually get local government to share its data with the centre when it's not necessarily in its own short-term interest. But this speaks to something which has come up across this conversation, which is it's all very well having incredibly high ambitions or embracing the latest technologies, or systems, or spending lots of money, but ultimately, so much of this is about persuading different bits of government to do things. I mean, we talked about national identity. The UK has sort of 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 different like national databases of various forms. You've got NHS numbers, tax records, welfare records, driving licenses. None of them actually talk to each other. And then, as one of the questioners alluded to, you've also got Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, all off sort of doing their own things. How do you incentivize people in government and the people you're working with out in government to actually pull together in the right direction? And I'd be interested in how really interested in how you've done this in Greece, and then maybe Matt has any thoughts on how we have or haven't done it well in the UK.
First of all, we had a dilemma, again, in the organizational design prior to the elections of 2019, what type of strategy we would follow in Greece. Would we move forward with a centralized model, with a very strong organization at the core of government, a decentralized model, a model where everybody makes their own sovereign choices on the basis of a central strategy? We opted for the centralized model exactly because we wanted to move quicker, but I would say also because the size of the country allowed for this policy. And in reality, apart from centralizing procurement and centralizing, let's say, the data strategy and the cloud service strategy, we also did something else, which in my view, I think it was the silver bullet of what we attempted to do. The Minister of Digital Governance in Greece has the sovereign capacity to interoperate any data set of the state. Meaning that you don't need to have, let's say, other cabinet members signing off the fact that their data set will be interoperating with the data set of another ministry. This organization has the capacity to do this itself with a single signature. Now, having said this, we took advantage of this piece of legislation, but in a de jure basis, not in a de facto basis. In a de facto basis, we tried to bring everyone on board, making everybody a co-owner of the strategy of interoperability, because at the end of the day, one of the key problems in our case was the fact that the lack of interoperability was reflected in the number of bureaucratic steps that citizens had to take. Let's say in the birth of a child, the bureaucratic steps for declaring the name of the child in Greece were 5. So the parents had to visit 5 different public services up until February 2020 to get the social security number of the child, or have it enrolled in the pension fund of one of the parents. So overall, this strategy, in my view, was very significant, and trying to bring everyone on board is important. Of course, funding helps. With municipalities, we have a smart cities project of 320 million euros but with a pre-selected menu on our behalf. So we select, let's say, the potential menu of solutions in accordance with our strategy, but we allow each municipality, each city of the 332 cities of Greece to pick it, to make its own choices from that menu. So we feel that this hybrid between the central government and the local level is the best potential approach in our case.
No, I think that's really interesting, and the way you put it there about wanting to have a one final arbiter, but in reality you want that final arbiter to be bringing everyone with them, because otherwise there's no point in having the conversation. And I think government does need to sometimes be a little bit more muscular from the centre on some of this stuff, saying these are projects that are in the interests of the public. They need to happen. I think that's particularly the case with some of the with some of the healthcare IT. But these are enormous projects, and ultimately, Greece. We talk about Estonia as being the model. Obviously, Estonia has a I think very small population. Greece obviously is sort of 10, 12 million people. I think it is a slightly different scale to the UK. But once you're at that sort of multi-million scale, then you do need to be thinking the sort of naive nirvana of one mega database is not going to happen. What matters, as to address Rob's point, is that the databases you've got talk to each other. And what you then start talking about really is a combination of security and privacy, and also the fact that those databases are often built on antique technology that needs updating in ways that the government doesn't always have a great track record of delivering, albeit sometimes through no fault of its own. So I think we do need to think about, where do those economies of scale come from? They probably come from investing in updating the technology that underpins it, as I sort of said at the beginning.
And can I just ask quickly, did you have any big issues with devolution in your former role?
Well, almost everything that I did was reserved effectively on this sort of stuff. But where you do, so for instance, it's a very different example, but for instance, on the broadband rollout programme, we'd said to the Scottish government that it felt like it was the right thing for the rollout programme to continue, for them to deliver a lot of it, even though it's technically a reserved matter. What that meant was that we were just on a very different timetable. And so some of this stuff is very practical rather than the sort of philosophical stuff around devolution that we often get hung up on.
Priya or Dr. Brooks, if you'd like to comment and offer some concluding thoughts, as we are almost out of time.
Sure. I'll just go really quickly. Look, I think what we need to do is, with policymakers, with everybody, if we could spell out actually what this looks like, if the data spoke to each other, this is what the world could look like. If we could see how someone's education can affect, their health, affect future in terms of skill, affect their jobs, can affect their security. Imagine that real-time data, real-time evidence-based policy making. That's a really exciting prospect. So what are the goals here? What do we want to achieve? What are Greece going to be able to, what is that country going to be able to achieve now that that all sits together? And actually showcasing that in a user story, if you like, for citizens, with the levelling up agenda, it's a central heart. How could we improve the lives from those in certain different backgrounds based on that real-time data? Bringing that to life is incredibly exciting, and I think that's what needs to be done, so that in all of those different departments we can excite people, we can make it urgent for them, we can show them how this would actually affect their day-to-day. And then on the flip side, just explain to them, well, if Google expands its education program outside of Google Classroom, and then they're collecting data on devices, Apple are doing the same on devices, then actually these other organizations might be able to connect some of that data a lot quicker and faster than government can. And that will be a very, very sad situation, because actually government needs to be able to make policy decisions based on that data. So I think explaining it in those sorts of ways to make it real for people, and then having departments full of experts, subcontracting that, working with the likes of AWS and experts out in the field to figure out how we can do the best for our citizens, I think is probably the way forward with some of these pilot projects for departments that have already, taken some steps forward. And in the UK, I would certainly say that very much sits with NHSX, because that is certainly, they're very forward thinking in what they're being able to do there. Thank you.
So just 30 seconds maybe for me, Robert, to conclude here. I think, we have to make it easy. We need to make it technically easy, technologically easy for our customers, for governments to make this change. And so that's what we're focused on. We've seen that top-down political leadership is important, setting that vision, but also setting goals along the way. So don't get too hung up on a big project that has a 3-year time frame, because it's hard to get started. The key thing for us is just getting started, setting some goals along the way, setting some pilot projects, some mid to near term achievements that can be done in a near term fashion easily. Just get the ball rolling and just get started, and then and then the momentum will build, and before you'll be able to do some of the things that Greece has done and other countries and make that transformation. So that's the way we see it.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you to all our panelists, in particular Minister Pierrakakis. If I can just have a brief moment to plug the next CPS event, because it is a pretty amazing one. On November 22nd, next Monday, we will be taking over the Guildhall at the City of London for our annual Margaret Thatcher conference in honour of our co-founder, which this year is on trade. We will have the Trade Secretary, we will have Lord Frost, the Brexit negotiator and Europe Minister, we will have Fraser Nelson, we will have Peter Mandelson, we will have the former US trade representative, we will have the former deputy director of the WTO. We will have an astonishing range of people. Please look at cps.org.uk and book your ticket now, because it will be fantastic. But in the meantime, thank you so much to everyone for joining us, and hopefully this is the start of a very interesting conversation going forward.